My name is Amelia Mutter. I'm also a researcher here at SLU and within work package 1 of the Mr. Environmental Communications program, where I have a case study on local water governance. So something a little bit different than what Martin was just talking about, although we also collaborate on other things, or actually that as well, yeah. And my talk today I'm calling Environmentality and Environmental Subjectification of Local Water Coordinators. So to discuss what governmentality is happening here, it's important that we first understand what this local water governance is. So this case study has focused on something called the LEVA-project, which was funded through the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management from 2018 to 2021. And this project had the aim of creating a new long-term way of working and implementing more measures against eutrophication of lakes and seas. And I think it's also worth mentioning that LEVA stands for, in Swedish, local engagement for water. And so, yeah. And as you can see from this map, the project initially included 20 pilot areas all over Sweden. And I borrowed this map from their project website and introduced this new role of so-called water coordinators, or in Swedish, they're actually called water measure coordinators, but that felt a little bit clumsy. So we're going to call them water coordinators. And what these people do, for the most part, is they're engaged in water management, introducing new water management measures on private land. So that most often involves dialogues with one or more landowners and other stakeholders to determine what kind of measures should be introduced, but also with the implementation of the actual measures. So facilitating processes like assisting with contacts, but also dealing with some of the paperwork involved with introducing these measures, such as applying for funding. And it's also worth mentioning that you can see on the map that these are sort of like slightly weird shaped areas, since most of these coordinators are employed in actually water catchment areas. So that means that in practice, a lot of them sit a bit on the side of traditional governance structures, although they may be employed at municipalities, at local, what do they call it? County administration boards, we call them in English, or at water councils. So I thought it was interesting to explore this project through an environmentality lens. Environmentality is the process through which communities and individuals self-regulate their resource use towards ends desired by the state. And I would argue that this water coordinator role could be considered as a new technology of environmental governance, because they're going out and they're trying to do something to facilitate something in the interests of the state, but a bit to the side of traditional governance structures. So they sort of have their own agency, and they're a bit of a different in a different role. So what is this? How do we define this new technology? Well, it's about inextricably linked elements of politics, institutions, and identities. And this results in the formation of a new sphere in which power can be exercised, influencing shifts in 3 areas: governmentalized localities, or new centers of environmental decision-making; regulatory communities, where social interactions around the environment take form; and finally, and most interestingly, or what we're going to focus on in this talk, is environmental subjects, or people who've come to think and act in new ways in relation to the environmental domain being governed. And so this idea of environmentality builds on the work of Arun Agarwal, but also Foucault's governmentality, if you're familiar with that. So yes, so I thought it was interesting to consider the role of these water coordinators as new environmental subjects. Of course, it's not as though they didn't engage with environmental issues before taking on this role, but since they're engaged in water governance through eutrophication and biodiversity measures primarily, that becomes the focus of their role. Meanwhile, they're also engaged in turning landowners into environmental subjects because they're trying to encourage them to implement these measures on their lands. And I chose this quote because I thought it sort of helped communicate what's happening, which is that how the rearrangement and transformations of institutions, they have important effects on framing people's interest, the way they act in relation to their interests, their involvement in the enactment of regulation, and the manner of their engagement with the process of governance. So I think this is what's happening here with the water coordinators. However, it's a bit more complicated than that, because although these coordinators are environmental subjects, that's only one of their many roles. They also engage with a lot of other activities, and often their jobs involve the balancing of a lot of different interests and values. So I call this coordinators wear many hats. This is a metaphor coming from the coordinators themselves, that in addition to being environmental subjects working towards implementing environmental measures, they also see themselves very much as neutral actors. So because they sit a bit to the side of traditional government structures, they don't necessarily have to fit within the regulations of traditional governance. And it also gives them the benefit that the farmers also view them as neutral actors. So as one of them said in this quote, that they said to them that it's great, the farmer said, because we can talk to you about everything. So they have this ability of decoupling a little bit from traditional governance structures, and it helps them build trust with the farmers. But it also contradicts a little bit with this other hat they wear as process experts. As I mentioned, one of their essential roles is helping to navigate the finance structure, and also some of the, like the regulations, making sure all the paperwork is in order. So they have to have this like bureaucratic knowledge of how to file that kind of thing. And as this quote suggests, that landowners just don't feel like they have time to do that. So they're really happy when the coordinator says that they can do that for them. So this makes it much easier and more accessible for landowners to actually implement these water governance measures. Thirdly, and I would say most importantly to the coordinators themselves, is this role of farmer advocates, where they talk about how the environmental measures that they introduce are only beneficial if they actually benefit the farmers. So they don't want to do anything that's economically damaging. They don't want it to be costly. And so as this quote says, they shouldn't compete with sustainable farming. And most often they mean this on the individual scale of the landowner where the measure is being introduced. But sometimes they also take this to the next level of being rather about benefiting farming as a greater practice in the area. For example, one of them told me that they avoided introducing environmental measures on like prime arable land, even if the landowner was on board, because they felt like this was sort of against the greater good of sustainable farming. And then finally, something I called spiders in a web, that they also have this contact network. They work very heavily with creating collaboration between different landowners, for example, but also between the landowners and other actors. And so this is a little bit different, I think, than the process experts, where it's more about knowing how things work. And instead, it's about knowing people and knowing how to connect people. So this is where they connect to the work package that's a lot about dialogues and collaborative processes. But in my final slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I see this means for them as practitioners, because often it's ambiguous or conflicting when they're trying to wear many hats. Which one do they wear in different situations? How do they deal with these conflicting interests at the same time? For example, if you take this example of the farmer advocates, if you're trying to be a farmer advocate, sometimes that means that you maybe can't be a good environmental subject because you can't promote the benefit of biodiversity and not eutrophication, anti-eutrophication, I guess, while also benefiting sustainable farming more generally. It also indicates tensions between the emergent technology and incumbent structures and practices, because although the coordinators see themselves as somewhat aside the governance structure, they talk about themselves a lot as neutral actors. In practice, this isn't the case. For example, they're very reliant on getting other state funding to actually do these measures. So they have to also understand all of these different levels of institutions and governance and how to navigate them so they can actually see some of these water governance measures to fruition. And then finally, there's this question of power, which we like a lot in our work package, and is a bit interesting because all of the measures we're talking about here are voluntary measures, or the vast majority of them anyway. And so that means that planners, the coordinators, although they have some power in the way that they have authority as government officials, whether or not they want to see themselves that way, they're also really reliant on the fact that the landowners eventually agree to the introduction of these measures. Otherwise, they can never get anything done. So that's my final point.